So we go from that to some real news. This would be Dan Barry from the New York Times, who we've had on the show numerous times before, and Dan has a new book out. It's a collection of his columns for the New York Times over years. Dan has written a column called "This Land" for years from across the country, various parts of the U.S. And Dan, are you on the line with us now?
I am. I'm just listening.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on. And this is "This Land: America Lost and Found," right? It's just coming out now.
That's right. Thank you.
Right. Yeah.
And where does hope and redemption come in?
Hopefully, all through it, right?
It's there. It's there.
Yeah.
So that is well. Then you wrote about the folks out in where was it?
Iowa.
Iowa, yeah. And then
the previous book, right?
Yeah.
Boys in the Bunkhouse, right?
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
And bottom of the third, was it?
Right, bottom of the 33rd.
33rd, right. And
the longest baseball game in pro baseball history, or semi-pro baseball, right?
No, pro. That's
pro.
right.
Right, it is a pro. Yeah.
What was
Pawtucket.
when did that happen, Dan? Just as a
the longest game in baseball history was in April of 1981 on Holy Saturday night in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and it lasted that night into Easter Sunday for some 8 hours. And then they finally suspended it, and they picked it up in June, and it lasted, the 33rd inning lasted about 18 minutes, and then it was over.
The 33rd inning.
Right.
3-3.
Yeah, the age that Jesus was when he was crucified, as you know.
That's right, yeah. Well, we all have our hang-ups.
That's right.
Sorry about that. So the latest book is a collection of the columns?
Right. So for 10 years, beginning during the Bush administration and then through to the beginning of the Trump administration, I pretty much wandered around the country on the New York Times' dime and filed dispatches from all 50 states over that time.
And what do you have any the columns, Dan? Do you have any strictures or restrictions or anything about the subject? Do you have to discuss the column with the editors and the publishers and all sorts of people?
There was really no restrictions, Malachy. It was basically the editors trusting my news judgment and my ability to find a story in kind of like godforsaken places. So there was never any restriction. What the challenges were to mix up the kinds of columns I filed. So some would be, I would say, angry, and some would be happy, and some would be poignant, and also to move around the country, make sure that I wasn't filing dispatches only from Rhode Island. So every week, a photographer I was working with, whether it was Angel Franco or Nicole Bengevino or Todd Heisler, we would say, all right, where are we going next? We would file the story on like a Friday, and on a Monday we'd be on a plane somewhere.
Now, Dan, I just wanted to point out to listeners who aren't familiar with Dan's columns, these aren't stories where the biggest story of the day, and he's flying out to the big hurricane in the Carolinas or Katrina, the levees. These are stories. These are smaller scale stories about kind of a small town with a particular problem that kind of perhaps tells a bigger story, and that I feel like that's one of Dan's great skills, is finding these kind of smaller bore stories that in giving the details and breaking down a small story in a small town could almost tell a much bigger story on either on national scale or whatever. And
right.
And I wonder, Dan, how you did, since Malachy did bring that up, like how now this isn't something where an editor is telling you, Dan, go to Kansas, and you're finding this stuff. And how do you find it, and what's your sensibility in when you're looking for that kind of thing?
Sure. So first of all, I would. It depended on the week, Corey, because there were times when a tornado would hit, or a hurricane would hit, or there would be some kind of catastrophe that would require kind of an all-hands-on-deck response from the New York Times, and I would oftentimes be sent to those areas. Say a tornado that did some significant damage in Oklahoma. I would go and I would try to find a story that was, related to the news yet off the news, if you know what I mean, like something that would not necessarily have been noticed or addressed in the larger main story. But most of the time, you're exactly right. I would be looking for things that were off the news. And so the way I would do it would be to, as I said, mix up the calculus, moving around the country, and also trying not to do a series of sad stories in a row that would make you want to slit your wrists. I'm drawn to that, being a dark Irish guy. So what I would do is read. I would basically parachute into a state virtually by going to a state's collection of newspapers, their websites, and then say if I were going to wanted to go to Illinois, I wouldn't look at the Chicago Tribune's website. Rather, I would look for a much smaller newspaper, say the Peoria paper, and then from there, I would look at the community briefs. I would look at the little news items and see if there was something possible to tease out into something larger, something more illuminating about how we live as Americans. And so a good example is, I hadn't been to Arizona lately. I had that thought, and so I was, noodling around, and I found that there was going to be a breakfast at an American Legion in the middle of nowhere. Really, it was right next to Needles, California, and the breakfast was a farewell breakfast for an 18-year-old girl woman who had just enlisted in the Army because she wanted to go to college, and the Army said, if you sign up for a couple of years, we'll give you $35,000. And so I called up Franco and I said, we have to go down to this pancake breakfast, really, because what was happening was a bunch of motorcyclists were then going to take her on a procession from the pancake breakfast all the way to Las Vegas, where she was going to catch a plane to Fort Hood and begin her service. And I thought, that's a profound moment, isn't it? Here's an 18-year-old kid, basically. Her prom had only been a couple of months earlier. Now she's joining the Army when we're at war. She was about 5 feet tall, really, 5'1" maybe. So Franco and I flew out there, and we were there for the breakfast, and then we followed the procession from outside of Needles, California, all the way to Las Vegas. And her father was unable to attend the breakfast because he worked at an auto dealership, and it was kind of a painful thought that he couldn't be there for this farewell. But as the procession was leading out of this small town, here was a man on a pickup truck leaning against his pickup truck, and it was her father. And the procession stopped, and the two of them hugged, and it was a beautiful, sad, profound moment.
Yeah.
And then the procession carried on, and she went on to Las Vegas and then on to Fort Hood. And in her small house, on the mantle, there was one of those blown-up checks that you see sometimes when people win the lottery or something like that.
Oh, yeah,
and it said to the woman's name, and it was about 3 feet by 5 feet, and it said to Ms. Risha Kane from the Army, the United States Army, $35,000. So was that news? I don't know, but did it capture a moment in time in this country? I think it did.
Well, it's our land, isn't it? Now, the guy in the White House, it's very hard to have a conversation without it, but I call him the 4F president, speaking of military service. He's the future former failed president, and he was 4F because he had a bone spur on his penis, and he couldn't get into the army on account of that bone spur. But he has been derogating the Times as failed, and every time he speaks of it, it gets more subscriptions. But when
We're very grateful to him.
yeah, he's very, very good. He's a very good spokesperson, and I don't know how much you pay him, but anyway, he's worth every penny of the money the Times does give him. The 4F man, and there we. So when on your own books, how again you wrote a memoir.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're and you're also you also have a doctorate, honorary doctorate. So you are Dr. Barry, are you not?
I insist that my wife and my children refer to me as Dr. Barry at all times.
Of course, that's. You're not too strict about it, but I guess, sometimes they will slip up. But you have to understand that.
Yes, I've earned it.
People,
right.
Of course you did, Dr. Barry.
Dan, you also have a collection of your New York City columns as well, right? Like years ago.
I do. So the column that Jim Dwyer writes now about New York, I wrote from 2003 through 2006. And, there's a collection of those called City Lights.
Yeah.
How would you compare writing? You were essentially doing the same thing, but in New York, right? I mean, maybe not exactly the same, but again, you weren't going for the big story of the day, but you were going for, kind of smaller, more human stories and that type of thing. Maybe not so much going to tell the bigger story of New York City, but I mean, they had their own place. Like, how would you compare, doing what you did with the column in New York to doing what you did with the column across the country?
Well, the first thing is the commuting was easier
I would imagine.
than doing it from New York. I would come up with a great idea, and here I would be in Staten Island, and that's okay. And then writing the This Land column, I'd come up with a great idea, and here I have to fly to Seattle and then get in my car and drive 3 hours to some place, because oftentimes I would not write from from one of the main cities. I would fly to Denver, or I would fly to Omaha.
Almost the whole point of the column, right?
Right,
yeah.
to kind of go to places that don't necessarily get a lot of coverage, which is also kind of wacky to show up in a place like Pine Grove, Arkansas.
Saying you're from the New York Times.
Saying you're from the New York Times, and first there's this kind of level of disbelief, like, why are you here?
Yeah.
And I would explain, well, I read in the paper that a woman accidentally knocked over the only phone booth in town. Her car, she went off the road, she nodded off, and she hit the only phone booth in town outside of an old motel, and that there was an effort to kind of restore the phone booth, and that's why I'm here. And they would look at me like I was mad. You came from Manhattan to Arkansas to write a story about a knocked-over phone booth? So, they might be right. Maybe I was mad, and maybe the New York Times was mad for paying my airfare, but, from that, I thought I saw an opportunity to kind of like write an essay really about how we used to communicate and how we communicate now. Remember phone booths?
And the use of coinage and the friendliness of it, and that you closed the door and you had privacy, and there you are. Now, Dan, when doing this, we do this radio show. It's once a week sort of situation for me. Mm-hmm. And Corey comes to my house and picks me up, and we drive out to Brooklyn. But many times coming here, I haven't the foggiest idea about anything, and I don't know what the hell am I going to say when I get on that into that studio. Michael G. Haskins gives us a great greeting, and would you ever wake up in the morning and say, I have no idea what I'm going to write about?
Yes.
Once in a blue moon.
When I was doing the About New York column, you try as hard as you can to plan ahead, but also be available intellectually to some breaking news of the day. But there were many times when I was doing the About New York column where I would wake up on a Tuesday, and I had to file something on a Wednesday,
Yeah.
and I had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah.
And the same thing would happen in a different way when I would do the This Land column. They would say go to Joplin, Missouri, for example, where there had been a tornado, and come up with a story. And now that's a paralyzing thought. You fly 1,000 miles to Joplin, Missouri, and you have to come up with a story, and you don't know anybody really, and it has to be more than a story, doesn't it? It has to be a column. It has to have a beginning, middle, and end. And so the idea would always be to try to write a short story, often on deadline or a quasi-deadline. So those were difficult mornings, I'll tell you that, waking up and flying out and trying to find something, or waking up in a hotel room somewhere and saying, I have no goddamn idea what I'm going to write about today, but I know they want a story today. So,
and would it be that you start off, there's an awful lot of water on the ground here. Now, where do I go from here?
Right. And you know what? It's wet. The water is wet. It's wetter than we're used to. Yeah. So what you do, and Corey is among the best at this, you open your senses up and you go out and you begin to engage people, and you begin to turn on all the faucets of your sensory perception, and you look for possibility. You start talking to people, and they'll lead you to somewhere else. Oftentimes when I would go to a place, an out-of-the-way place, and say I wasn't on a strict deadline, the first place I would go to would be the local library.
Yeah.
And, I would walk into what they would say is the local history section. And I would spend some time getting to know the place I was about to write about a little more deeply, to get a sense of what matters to these people.
Yeah.
What are they proud of? And read the local newspaper a little bit, and then I felt a little better prepared when I would engage people in the town.
Do you run into any antagonism because of the attempt to this, the 4F guy at the White House is constantly derogating the Times and calling it fake and so on and so forth. Do you run into any antagonism from his followers?
I would say not that much. I remember many years, say maybe more than a decade ago, a year after Hurricane Katrina, I was in Alabama, and I was writing about some of the devastation there from the hurricane. And this is my only time having this happen to me. A guy says, "Oh, and you're, Barry, so you're a papist." Like someone in the 2000s calling me a papist.
Yes.
And I said, yes, I'm a practicing papist. I'm a non-practicing. I'm a collapsed papist. I don't know, but I'm a proud papist in this context. In terms of Trump, usually there is some of that, but Malachy, I think people are people, and first of all, they're honored that you've traveled to hear them, rather than to make assumptions about who they are simply because they are from a region that has some kind of stereotypical reputation. And you're here to dispel with that stereotype, and you're willing to sit down and just spend time with them. And so any of that, that friction that you might imagine at the beginning, whether because there's perceptions that I'm from the East Coast and therefore, and I'm with the failing New York Times, it falls away when you begin to just talk to people and you find the commonality in the struggle, the daily struggle of just trying to get by.
Of being human. And I know that I don't care what people's opinion is of whether you're for the Times or against the Times or neutral on the Times and so forth. But when the phone rings, and I don't know anybody that does, when they say this is so-and-so New York Times, immediately backs straighten up, and people just pay absolute attention because it is important when you're talking to the New York Times, no matter what people say.
Well, I wouldn't say every time.
I would.
I've had some.
Well, whether it's good or bad, but it is. There's always some kind of a very active reaction. There's no such thing as neutrality as when you receive a call about the New York Times. That's my opinion, anyway.
No, I think that's true, and I do think, though, Malachy, it's probably truer in media savvy places. The New York Times, there's a certain gravitas that is attached to the name.
Yeah.
But in say Arkansas, they're probably more interested in what the Fayetteville paper says.
Yeah.
Because that's what they and their friends all read, right?
You're right, though. There is a certain assumption, and that can work both ways, though, can't it? One way is, this is serious, this is the New York Times, or the flip of it is, this is the New York Times, they're coming here to make fun of us. They're coming to, pay flicking attention to flyover country. They're coming to espouse their leftist ideals. So it works both ways. What I do is, I don't know if I present as a typical New York Times person. I didn't go to an Ivy League. I look like, a kind of a goofy bald guy, and I can be self-deprecating, and I find ways to connect with people because, and it's not a conceit, is it? It's really genuine curiosity and interest in who you are as a person. Let's dispel with what I might have preconceived, my preconceived thoughts might have been about, say, this stretch of Kentucky, and what your preconceived notions might have been about the New York Times. Let's just sit down and have a cup of coffee.
Yeah. And when you are writing, would you go from notes and then you have to go back to wherever you are and rethink what it is, the impression you had of the person that you're... It's mostly individual people, isn't it?
Yeah. What I usually do is ingest some laudanum, and then I go into some kind of opium-like haze, and it's sort of like Byron-esque, Malachy. No,
I got you.
As soon as I meet a person or as soon as I leave a situation, an event, and Corey will back me up, your mind is already whirring, spinning with ways to how do you begin this story?
Yeah.
How do you begin it? So from the very start, your mind is looking for how do I lead this story? How do I draw the reader in with the first image or two?
Yeah.
And so then when I finally sit down, and sometimes it's in a hotel room, or sometimes it's in the newsroom, or sometimes it's in my car, you are just trying to figure out how to draw the reader in. And sometimes that first thought that you have, that first image that you think will lead the reader in, winds up being your kicker. It'll wind up being the end of your story.
Right.
So it's that kind of a process. To me, it's like, not to go on about this, but I think that when people read the newspaper or read a website, they're looking for reasons not to read these stories. Okay?
Yeah.
They'll look at the headlines and say, I know about that. I don't need that. I don't have time for that. So the game is on, right? And so Corey may have a great story at one corner of the website or the front page. And I love Corey, but screw him. I want you to read my story. And so I'm thinking that way competitively. How do I, if you're going to give me 5 seconds of your time, that first paragraph has to be very powerful. And it's a way to say, okay, I'll give this person another 5 seconds. Think about this. This is the game, right?
Especially
we're
these
all
days,
asking people for about 15, 20 seconds. And then hopefully, after 15 to 20 seconds, they're drawn in by the language and by the imagery and by the story, and they'll stay with you for 4 or 5 minutes. And that's the game that I play, trying to figure out how to draw you in that first few dozen or 100 words.
That's the game I used to play in my family growing up.
Yeah.
Just 5 seconds.
Well, our guest is Dan Barry, and the name of and his latest book, who's published this one?
It's a great publisher called Black Dog and Leventhal, and one of the reasons we went with them, well, one, they were interested in the book, so that
That helps.
they already went high on the list.
Yeah.
But is because they give great care to reproduction of photographs, and so the book is kind of heavy, but it's because it's using a heavier stock of paper. So the great photographs of Angel Franco and Nicole Bengevino and Todd Heisler and Damon Winter and some other people, get the full force in the reproduction.
Yeah,
and they've done a splendid job with it.
Okay. Well,
Okay,
thank
it's
you
Dan
very
Barry.
much, Dan.
I see Dan Barry, danbarryonline.com, right, Dan? That would be a good place for people to see your collected, your oeuvre.
Yeah.
What's that word?
My canon.
Yeah, your canon.
Yeah.
Canon.
Yeah.
danbarryonline.com. And the book is called This Land.
Get the book, This Land. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
As
All
always.
right, gentlemen, thanks for having me.
All the best. Right.
On we go.
We're still WBAI 99.5.